Well, good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen, and a very, very warm welcome to you all to this ACBC Victorian Government event on More Than Sport. I'm Virginia Birrell, the CEO of the Australia-China Business Council, and it's my absolute pleasure to be welcoming you today. I do want to thank Global Victoria and Global Victoria Women for their support of this event. In the spirit of reconciliation, as is part of our cultural practice in Australia, I'd like to acknowledge the traditional custodians of the country throughout Australia and their connections to the land, sea and community. I pay my respects to their elders past, present, and extend that respect to all Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples today. As this event is online, I'd also like to acknowledge the traditional owners of the lands where you may be zooming in from around Australia today. Cultural diplomacy, equitable opportunity and the value of sport to both Australia and China unlocks unique avenues for constructive dialogue and collaboration, bridging the cultural divide. Today's event aims to highlight these cultural links and to reconsider how business community can help rebuild bilateral communications through sporting interaction and professional female leadership. A little housekeeping. Please feel free to turn on your camera. We're running this as a round table event with plenty of interaction and dialogue. So please do have your camera on so that we can see you as though you were in the room with us. Post any questions you may have in the chat box or raise your hand, and we will try to get through all of those during today's session. The event is being recorded and a copy will be made available to all the attendees after the event. We have a couple of changes in our lineup of our speakers. Isabel Zhang is unfortunately unwell, and we send her our best wishes for a full recovery. Also, we are very delighted to welcome Sarah Stiles, the Director of the Office of Women in Sport and Recreation, and she is able to join us for part of this session. So thank you very much, Sarah, for attending. Our moderator today is Tom Parker. Tom is a China specialist with extensive experience in the Australia-China bilateral relationship. As a Mandarin speaker, Tom has held China-focused roles in AsiaLink, Austrade Beijing, the City of Melbourne. He's been a writer and reporter for the ACBC, both in China and Australia, for Radio National's Asia Pacific program. He has had his own consultancy company and has worked for Bastion. Tom is also a Vice President of ACBC Victoria. In 2018, he joined the AFL in the newly created role as Head of China, a very impressive title, Tom, to drive commercial outcomes from the ongoing engagement and games being played in Shanghai. So I'll now pass over to Tom to formally introduce our speakers. Thank you.
Thank you, Virginia. Yes, it's quite the title, and welcome everybody. It's wonderful to have a number of very familiar faces in the sports industry here, as well as a number of AFL multicultural ambassadors as well. So welcome everyone, as well as to the Deputy State Director of DFAT. I think today's session, as you can tell from kind of the clothes that I'm wearing, and I think even Anne's wearing, it is very much one not of leisure, but of being comfortable and ensuring that we've got the opportunities within which to have the conversation. So rather than sort of presentations and slides, it's going to be conversations. And I'm delighted that our first speaker today is actually Sarah, and Sarah Stiles is the second person in the Office of Women in Sport for the Victorian Government, which is a really crucial role and I guess a reflection of the work that different sports codes are doing, but also the government in ensuring promoting participation and engagement in sports for women, not just in terms of playing, but also representing in administration and in leadership. Sarah's background is one of a range of different sports, and most recently through Cricket Australia and the phenomenally successful World Cup that happened just before we all went into lockdown. And Australia winning and Katy Perry on the stage, it was a great occasion. But I know Sarah's going to tell us more about her background and the reflection in her journey as she speaks with us today. So I'll invite Sarah to kick things off.
Thank you, Tom. Thank you, Virginia, and thank you so much for having me here today. It's a real joy to be able to, when I am so early in this new role, to have the opportunity to speak to groups like today, and just sort of connect with the wider network of groups that there are that perhaps I may not have been aware of before. So thank you so much. When the question first came about joining today, I immediately loved this idea of setting the conversation around more than sport, because I know what I do as director of the Office for Women in Sport and Recreation. It fundamentally is driven for me from this idea of more than sport. I grew up in a very small town in southwest Victoria, down towards the 12 Apostles, where sport was just a fundamental part of what we did. To be honest, there wasn't too much else for us to actually do in a small town like that. So that's where my love of sport came from. And it would be really easy to simply say, I work in sport because I love sport, but it's so much more than that. And that's a really important point for me to start on, because today I'm sure I'm talking to some people who do similarly love sport. But this is also about the people who perhaps are a little bit indifferent, perhaps even on the, I'm not sold on sports side, because there is so many reasons that we do want to connect with this work, because love it or hate it, there is nothing that captures the Australian psyche, the Australian, the mood of the nation like sport does. And I get the sense that it is the same in China as well. The second thing that really drives me beyond my love of sport is exactly that. It's the ability to drive wider change through sport. And by showing what is possible in an industry or in a sector like sport, we are actually showing what is possible for beyond that. So if I think in an Australian context, we can drive change through sport. And that's setting the tone for our corporate environments, our educational environments, and our government around what is possible in the representation and the opportunities and the success and celebration of women. On a personal note as well, this idea of the role of sport to help bridge that cross-cultural divide is actually something really important for me. I know I grew up in an environment where sport was just what we did. In my family, I have two sisters, and we were raised in a way where it was completely naturally, it was a completely natural world for us to be competitive. And it wasn't until I was much older and actually took on my first role at Cricket Australia, having actually started my career as an investment banker, that I realized that what was completely normal for me was nowhere near as common as I perhaps thought it was. And that connection to sport actually went back to my grandparents, and particularly the connection, this cross-cultural divide piece is really important for me when I think about my granddad's experience. And my grandfather and his wider family actually came to Australia after the Second World War. They actually came from a non-English speaking country, and it was actually through sport, and particularly cricket and football, that my granddad learned how to speak English and built his community that he still actually lives in today. He's actually in his late 80s. So for me, this idea of this cross-cultural divide and this idea of being more than sport, I heard from Virginia, from Tom, what today was about. I'm like, yes, I'm in. I would love to be a part of that. So as I mentioned, I actually joined the office only last month. So as the second ever director of the Office for Women in Sport and Recreation here in Victoria. It is a unique team. It's actually an office that doesn't exist anywhere else in Australia just yet. And that's something that I would love to see change. The purpose of the office is to level the playing field for women in sport and recreation. So we're here to tackle and dismantle the barriers that are perhaps not letting women do what they would like, and girls to do what they would like in sport. So whether that is from a community level, at a grassroots level, having an environment that you find welcoming and that you're comfortable in, to the facilities that you can actually access, making sure girls have change rooms that they can actually use. No more getting changed in the car, no more getting changed in the public toilets like perhaps we've had in the past, right through to the boardrooms of those biggest sporting organisations and ensuring we're seeing gender diversity in those rooms. What I love as well, and what I'm still learning, is actually, though, we're this team in this wider system of the Victorian government that's seeking to drive change for women in sport. And that includes Global Victoria, who I know are a big part of today's event. And, I think about some of the things that I was able to see from the outside, like at that the ICC T20 World Cup final at the MCG last year, which I know Global Victoria uses this wonderful platform to bring women from not only across Victoria, but internationally together and have that ability to have that networking event through the platform of women's sport. I'm also thinking towards later this year, where there's the Sports Next conference that's actually going to be held here in Melbourne for what's going to be an amazing opportunity. And one of the key themes there is actually going to be around women's sport and how we can further that conversation. So yes, we're trying to drive change as the office, but we're working within this world that is trying to drive wonderful change both in and through sport. So what I hope to achieve in what I'm doing with the office is that more Victorians are connected to the Change Our Game movement than ever before. So the Change Our Game movement, you might be able to see it, hang on, my pen's not working, up in the top corner. The Change Our Game movement is how the office works with the community and with the sector to drive that change that I mentioned before, to tackle those barriers. At the same time, what I hope to bring to the office is a greater recognition that not everybody's journeys is the same. And we need to give particular mind to the different barriers that women from different backgrounds might be coming from. So whether that is a cultural background, whether that is disability, whether that is a range of different factors that may be shaping that person's pathway, their journey in a different way than your programs perhaps in the past have assumed. There is no one size fits all, and our work needs to represent that, and our work needs to champion that it's not enough, particularly relevant for when we're working in a world that is increasingly diverse, in a country that's increasingly diverse, that it's not enough. Let's just use plain English. It's not enough to have 50-50 men and women in the boardroom if that boardroom is also completely white. So how do we recognize that diversity takes on many forms, and our work represents that? So what can I perhaps share with you about your connection to this cause? What would I love to see all Victorians, but particularly those of you I'm speaking to today, be able to connect to with this movement, and how can you be involved? So at the base level, that first cab right off the rank is simply encouraging female participation in sport and recreation, whether that is for you to always realize the benefits that are coming from being active and living an active life, or if it is encouraging others. And I'm particularly in that world thinking about the next generation coming through, young women, teenage girls. What we know is not only is sports participation so fundamentally important for our physical health, our mental health, but we also know if we want girls to excel, then sports participation is one of the most important things that they could do. And there's wonderful research that actually shows the connection between sports participation as a teenager through to leadership success in their careers. Because, if you want an environment to develop and foster those leadership skills, team sport is actually one of the best places that they can be. So that connection to career success and fundamentally realizing that connection to sport is a really important one from our perspective that we want to be talking about more. The second one, if I can say, well, how can you be involved, is simply put your hand up where you can. So whether that might be volunteering in community clubs, whether that might be accepting invitations to networking events at a sporting environment, even if that's not necessarily a sport that you might understand, and kind of going with and accepting that discomfort, knowing that we're all learning, we're always on this journey of learning, and you don't have to be an expert at a sport to take up that opportunity. right through, I mentioned at the start, our connection to those boardrooms of putting your hand up, that if you see that opportunity that matches your skill set around contributing to board environments, that is just so important for furthering the work that we're doing. And actually, one of the key programs that we run out of the office is the board quota that actually exists, the world first board quota that exists in Victoria, to have at least 40% women on the boards of state sporting bodies who actually accept funding from the state government. So that's something that we're really looking at, again, through that intersectional lens. A third one, and I'll have 4, and then Tom, I promise I'll wrap it up. But a third one is, how can you back women's sport? And that could be something as small as actually going along to a women's sporting event, right through to perhaps hosting an event, hosting networking opportunities through women's sport, right up to when we're trying to work on the financial support that exists around women's sport, how you might be able to challenge the environments you work in, if this is relevant, to say, okay, well, are we currently supporting sport? Are we sponsoring anyone? And what's that split at the moment between men and women's sport? Are we sponsoring sport, but actually it's 100% men? And what might we be able to do about that to bring that lens of gender equality to your organisation? And the fourth and final one is, I really encourage you to connect with our work and connect with us, the office. So we have social media channels through the Change Our Game branding. And please jump online, follow us, and start that conversation with us around what you would like to see. Sometimes the challenges that we tackle, they are only brought to light through people actually coming to us and go, by the way, do you realize this is happening? Can you help us? What can we do? And I would love to hear that somebody gets in touch with us to say, well, actually, I heard you speak on this webinar, and here's this issue I'd really like to bring to your attention. So please connect with us, and I look forward to getting to know you all. Thanks, Tom.
Fantastic. Thanks, Sarah. I mean, it's such a powerful and such a strong message, and I think sharing your story, but also more importantly, providing some real practical aspects towards how people, not just on this call, but more broadly, can also get involved. If you have any questions, the way that we're going to work today, unfortunately, Sarah has to jump off and won't be able to stay throughout the whole session. So if anyone has any particular questions, you can simply put them in the chat as if it was a normal kind of Zoom meeting, rather, because it is a round table. So if anyone has any specific questions for Sarah, now would be the time. I'm going to ask one of Sarah, and while I'm asking, and hopefully she's responding, feel free to ask any specific questions, and then I can either bring you up from a microphone perspective and to ask the question, or alternatively, I'm very happy to ask it on your behalf. You can send the question directly to me, or you can send it just to everyone in the chat function, and we can go from there. Sarah, just in terms of the uniqueness, as you said, of the office and the positioning, what have, in terms of over the last, since its, I guess, establishment, what have been some of the wins that the office has sort of seen? And I'll put up a hand and say that I know that Bridie, who was the inaugural director, and now is probably facing even harder challenges, as I know she's still within the public service, but many would know that she's on the Collingwood board, and whatever that, or for now anyway, I'm not sure what that means, but
no comment, Tom. No comment.
No, that's right. But I guess what I'm also interested in is that I know that whenever we had, particularly on our outbound China type conversations and panels and things like that, Bridie made it really clear that there needed to be equal representation of female commentators, experts,
yes,
analysts, and speakers on panels. And I thought that was really powerful, and she was unrepentant in her making it really clear that, you know, for us as the AFL, we really needed to make sure that that was something that we were leading and challenging. So that was something that we've seen personally. But yeah, just sort of wanted, in terms of coming in, what's been some of the wins and things that you're hoping to achieve?
So you're spot on, Tom, in that the work of the office is taking a really broad range of what are the different ways that people can actually engage with sport and what are the barriers and how do we tackle that. So I mentioned one of the key programs, which really is that world first, that it's actually a quota. It's not a target. It's not a target with teeth. It is a genuine quota around the requirement for gender diversity in the boardrooms of your state sporting bodies and that receive Victorian government funding. So in that context, that's, you know, Cricket Victoria, Gymnastics Victoria, or in the example of, say, Oz Cycling, which has recently collapsed its governance structure to be under one organisation. Oz Cycling, even though it is a national sporting body, is subject to that. And so for organisations that aren't meeting that 40% minimum requirement, they aren't eligible to receive new funding. So, you know, actually working through, okay, well, what does that mean? It's not like we sort of leave those organisations out there and kind of go figure it out for yourself. It's what are the systems that we might need to work with them on that to make sure that's right. Sports might need constitutional change that actually lets them pick their directors from a population that actually involves women. I've seen examples of that in the past. Or it simply could be they are from a heavily male-dominated sport and they need help connecting into networks of women who are open to joining their board in that skills matrix concept still. So yeah, I mean, the lens I like to take to it is any single touch point that women and girls have with sport, we can do better. So what does that look like? Another key program, you mentioned sports media, is the Making the Call program. So for women who are interested in sports broadcasting, that could be on camera. So you think about your commentators, or it could be behind the scenes with your producers and all the different roles that actually exist behind that. We actually have programs that help women identify, well, how can you build a career in sports broadcasting? And then extension programs, and that's a little bit of an FYI because they're going to come in the new financial year for the first time, of them really refining those skills and connecting into the industry to help you get those opportunities. Now, you know, that is from a range of sports, and we're particularly interested in sports that perhaps the original pilot program last year, almost from it came from the world that our program administrators had actually come from, which was AFL. But over time, or AFLW, over time, we're particularly looking at, well, what are the other sports that perhaps we're still looking at more, getting more women in those roles? So literally, I'd be very curious to know what are the different sports that people here might be interested in. And is there anyone on this call who, yes, it's natural that we could normally go straight to the boardroom, but is there anyone on here that's like, well, actually, I'm really interested in being involved with sports broadcasting in this sport. Is that actually a program that could be open to me? So that's another one. We also do AICD training, so provide particular courses to help with those governance skills for women, looking at those pathways to those boardrooms. And we also support generally professional development through scholarship programs and connect that down into the community with our community activation grants, where all sports clubs, all community sporting groups have the ability to put their hand up for funding to champion gender equality in their own world. So what I'm looking at the moment and what I'm going through the team is that's been an enormous power of work to get to that point with what is still a relatively small team. So now that they've done that, I almost feel blessed that coming in last month, I came in exactly when we had our funding confirmed for another 4 years. I've got this wonderful foundation that we're building from. And so what I'm working with the team on at the moment is then how do we refine that strategy so we're more efficient, so we can tackle some of the other things that perhaps we're not. So for example, we've spoken about career pathways into administration, career pathways into sports broadcasting. Well, what about coaching, or what about officials, or what about some of those other ways that you might actually engage with sport? What about girls, and are we doing enough to actually really tackle the barriers and the stereotypes that are preventing girls from seeing sport as open to them as it might be for their brothers? So that's what we're working through at the moment. So a little bit of watch this space. If I can, if you're comfortable, I can also go straight over to some of the questions that I can see is starting to come through in the chat box.
Yeah.
Yep.
So I know, to Shay, I've just put up a link to your to your website, and I think all your contact details are there, and that's great if you want to be involved. I think Anne's given you just a general kind of feeling of congratulations, but also watch out, because she's going to get involved with women's self-defense and follow up on that. But yeah, I think perhaps Colin and Rebecca have got some questions there if you'd like to respond to those. One about changing behaviours in sports clubs and boardrooms, which is really important.
And I mean, Colin makes a perfect point there, isn't it? It's when you're trying to drive change, there perhaps was a mindset in decades past of when you were looking at particularly around leadership, how you're trying to drive some of that. It was about fixing the women. So we'll give this woman this development program, or we'll give this woman more confidence. We've just got to get her more confidence and then she'll get there. Reality is we're working in this bigger ecosystem that when we want the women to get there, we want them to thrive. We want them to have a great experience. We want them to be able to fulfill their potential. And actually, a lot of that has nothing to do with the woman herself and everything to do with the environment that she is in. So that cultural change piece goes to the very heart of change our game. And so, you know, Colin's comment here around quotas on boards, you have to change the behaviour in the boardroom in sports clubs, 100%. We really do. You can't do one without the other, because if you only do the recruitment piece, guess what's going to happen? Your retention is going to be absolute bottom, and that's whether you're thinking boardroom or you're thinking your sports club. And you're going to be stuck in your recruitment cycle because no one is going to want to stay. So in terms of the boardroom piece, that kind of partnering that we do, that Vic Sport does with the sporting organisations to get them to understand what actually will get them to that diverse boardroom is really important there. At a kind of more administrative level, we work directly with sector leaders to understand that cultural piece and to kind of coach them on that journey of how do they foster one of those environments, right down into the sports clubs, where we've got programs that are almost like your train the trainer models. So we work with people who can then work at scale to how do you actually foster a club environment that is welcoming and inclusive for women and girls. Because otherwise this work is not sustainable. This is going to be short-term wins that will ultimately fade away, and that's not what we want. So if I just read Rebecca's question, we'd love to increase the number of women on the committee, hoping that that would increase our girls' participation programs. Are there funding programs at the office aids that we can help do this? Great question. So there are a couple, and the community activation grants is probably the one that really comes to mind. So the community activation grants is really open for community clubs. And forgive me, Rebecca, I can't quite see.
Sorry, hi, I'm Rebecca.
Oh, hello. So Rebecca, do you mean as AFL Victoria or as a community club?
So my job, I'm the participation coordinator for part of the Eastern region at AFL Victoria. So I work across a lot of the juniors and the Auskick community football side of things. So I guess it'd be great to implement it from an AFL Victoria level for the league as such, but I guess my role is purely in the Eastern region. So I guess, yeah, we have a few clubs that are really struggling with getting girls teams on board from the age of 10 all the way up to under 17s. So is there any way, I guess, that we can work with those committees to bring more female staff on board for the board to then obviously help increase that girls' participation?
Yep. So great question. And there's probably two things that come to my mind to begin with. So the idea here being that greater gender diversity in your decision-making rooms will create that inclusive environment that ultimately then, when girls are coming in, they're more comfortable in. So having that diversity, that holds true in all areas, doesn't it? It is, why do you want diversity? Because ultimately the expectation that those diverse candidates have had different experiences that they're bringing to the table. So they see opportunities and challenges in a different way. So being able to do that, at the moment, the board quota is at an AFL Victoria level.
Yeah.
So that there's not that compulsion, but it is about, well, how do you have that question of how do you tackle the diversity of those committee rooms? Can you start from a policy perspective?
Yeah.
So actually start the conversation from, well, what do we want? And then how do we put it in place, as opposed from the bottom up of, well, maybe we should go and get so-and-so. So if you can start from a policy perspective,
yeah,
and kind of make it that that clubs policies that actually we should have diverse decision makers. And if we don't, how do we welcome in others to help us? That could be a really interesting place to start.
Yeah, beautiful.
The second point, if I jumped over a little bit, is when we're thinking about these non-traditional women's sports, so your football codes, your crickets, ones like those, we shouldn't shy away from the fact that one of the most powerful groups that we actually have to get girls' participation in those environments are actually men. So I can remember a few years ago when I was still working in Cricket Australia, we did a quick poll of all of the underage girls who were playing at a national competition. So they were representing, Victoria, Queensland, New South Wales at an underage level. Yeah. And 87% of those girls had been introduced to cricket by either their father or their older brother.
Yeah.
And if you think about it, that kind of makes sense, because this stereotype of who played that sport in the past, it was their dad, it was their older brother, it wasn't their mum, because of the history of the sport. So that engaging men to see footy, in this case, as a sport for their daughters, actually enormous opportunity. So that it's that balance, isn't it? You want diverse decision makers because they're going to be able to make greater, bring almost like a higher quality of discussion to the room. But you also want to engage your dads to kind of say, well, why aren't you you're bringing your sons down? Why aren't your daughters here? And that might help you unpick what is some of the barriers. The barriers might be, well, actually, we're asking girls to come down at this time, at this point of the week, and most of the girls are actually playing a different sport at that time, or that is clashing with something else. So some of the practical pieces, and then kind of going into, okay, well, are girls coming and they're not staying, or are they not coming at all? Because that will help you go, well, what do we need to tackle? So really, if I take a step back, part of that is going back to that whole, one size doesn't fit all, and what might be the particular challenges in those environments that can help you sort of adapt your response to there, knowing that you're living in a world that is doing so well in showcasing that top of the pathway.
Yeah.
And, AFLW has done so well to, in the space of only 5 years, show this thriving pathway that celebrates the individual, and it's creating those career pathways. So you're very fortunate in that regard. But hopefully there's a couple of bits and pieces in there. And Rebecca, I'd be happy to continue that conversation offline if you'd like.
Yeah, beautiful. I'll connect with you outside of this. Thank you so much, Sarah.
No worries at all.
And Sarah, I think sort of a recent example for me highlights and brings to exactly what you were saying. So I've worked in football for a long time, and I've struggled to get my daughters involved in football, despite sort of subtle hints, and other not so subtle hints. And my 10-year-old decided that she would like to try it. So I live in the inner west, and Yarraville said, and Eagles, the president's a woman, and the coach of the I think it's the under 11s or under 12s, is a dad. And he said that he got into coaching because of his daughters. And so he brought his daughters down, and then he stayed on to coach through that. So yeah, it's just a kind of a classic example of exactly what you were talking about. And I think that last point too, the role that men can play in terms of changing that behaviour and providing those those influences. But Sarah, thank you so much for your involvement, and I think everyone can just sense the passion within which that this area is obviously, it's obviously a dream job probably, and it probably doesn't feel like work, but probably the amount of back-to-back meetings that you have at the end of the day, it's probably exhausted.
Have you seen my diary?
Yes, I have. But no, that's all right. But thank you so much. And as Virginia and many of the others that are on this call would be aware that the ACBC does take some, like the commercial interface, but also on some of these more broader kind of cultural and social issues is of great importance for us. And we've done a range of different series, and no doubt we'd love to have you back again and involved in our network. And thank you so much for your contribution today, Sarah. I think Zach's put up some virtual clapping, so if you can do that through your reactions, there we go. We'll do that as well. So thank you very much.
That's
Sarah.
very kind. Thank you so much. And I look forward to one day, hopefully getting to join one of these in person with you all.
Fantastic. Thank you so much, Sarah. And again, if anyone wants to contact Sarah, I'm sure Zach, in the sort of extensive post-event notes, there'll be the details for the Office of Women in Sport if people want to follow up on that. And, you know, Beck and others, if you want to contact her directly, I'm sure she'd be happy to do that as well. We're now going to go into our panel discussion. And similar to the conversation with Sarah, I'm wanting to lead off with each of our panelists and ask kind of a leading question that will hopefully open up the discussion. And then after we've gone through each three, I've got a couple of questions for the panels. But again, like Colin and Beck and Anne did, if you've got any questions, we'd love to make this as interactive as we can rather than just hearing from one or two people. And so with that, it gives me great pleasure to introduce Gronya. And Gronya is a soon-to-be Olympian, which is just awesome. So I'm pretty excited for the Olympics, but I'm even more excited because now I've got another kind of personal connection, hopefully, to follow in this success. Gronya's pretty much won everything in the Oceania and Pacific, and has dominated in doubles. I'm not putting any pressure on you, Gronya, in terms of medal expectations, but I think it's going to be wonderful for this group to watch your journey, hopefully in Tokyo. And is it less than 40 days? I don't know how close it is, but
5 days.
How many? 45?
25.
25, my God. That's, well, we're even more lucky to have you. I mean, you should be just sort of listening to meditation tapes and just being 100% focused, not taking up sort of an hour and a half of your day joining us. But we're incredibly lucky to have you. And I think one of the things that, as someone who spent a lot of time in China, is just know how popular the sport is in Asia, and not only China, but also throughout Southeast Asia. And Gronya, the question I have for you is that when we were preparing for this presentation, you shared with us, I guess, some really interesting insights that actually through the sport that you really took up when you were 12, it really helped you connect back into your Chinese heritage. Would you be able to sort of share that story with us today?
Yeah, so basically I'm half Chinese, half Australian. So my dad immigrated from Guangzhou, China when he was 6 years old. And my mother is Australian. So growing up, my dad passed away when I was 3 years old, and we didn't have that much family within Melbourne at the time. So I was brought up kind of through the Australian lifestyle, and, you know, played a diverse range of other sports like swimming, tennis, athletics, that kind of thing. And it was through a national talent identification program that I just happened to go to this tryout for a badminton program. And I'd never really played the sport before, wasn't aware of what it was and how huge it was in China and that kind of thing. But I got involved in the sport, started training up through this talent search program. And yeah, as I kind of got further into the badminton world, I realized how Asian dominated it is still within Australia. Like the clubs are predominantly, you know, Chinese, Indians, Sri Lankan communities play a lot of badminton here. And then through that, I've had a lot of opportunities to compete within China as well. So just through the community, like the players that I train with, the Chinese coaches that I've had, I've really had the opportunity to learn more about Chinese culture, the sport, and through that, I wanted to pick up Mandarin Chinese as well. So I've learned that online for the past 4 years with my Chinese teacher being in Beijing and, you know, traveling throughout China with her and being invited back to China for things like exhibition matches and that kind of thing. So yeah, it really helped me connect with my kind of the Chinese culture that I missed out on growing up. And yeah, I'm really grateful to have found badminton and to be able to reconnect with my heritage in that way.
And Gronya, would it be fair to say that if you, as you sort of said, because of your dad's passing at such a young age, did you feel like an outsider going into some of those kind of badminton where the clubs were, as you said, predominantly sort of Asian Australian? Was it something that it enabled you to connect in, I guess, obviously to your cultural heritage, but initially was there any kind of sense of disconnection?
I guess slightly, because I didn't feel like fully Chinese because I hadn't had the upbringing, you know, I hadn't experienced all the food and I don't know, the tiger parents and that kind of thing. So
That's not a bad thing.
I definitely felt more Australian, but it was a great learning experience to kind of see, you know, how everybody else lives and kind of, you know, indirectly learn through them what I kind of missed out as a child without my Chinese father around.
And is it fair to say partly, I mean, no doubt because of your badminton skill, but, you know, and as you said, your learning of Mandarin, but I understand that you discovered or were aware that you're related to a kind of a revolutionary figure from the Qing dynasty, Kang Youwei. Did that help? Have you kind of like got celebrity status in China because of that?
Yeah, so I was at an event in 2012, a badminton tournament, and they were doing a little news thing on me on, I think, CCTV5, is that the sport channel?
Yeah.
Because I was the youngest in the whole tournament. I think I was 15 years old. And my coach at the time was Chinese. So they interviewed him asking a little bit about me. And he just mentioned that I was, the 5th generation descendant of Kang Youwei, which, you know, in Australia, I didn't really understand how huge he was over there. And then once he mentioned that in that little news article, it really just blew up. And I had interviews the next day. I had people bringing me flowers. I was Googling everything about him so I could accurately answer all these interviews as well. And since then I've researched him a lot more and learned more about him myself. And I went to China actually and did like a 10-15 minute speech on him for a TV show about linking like him and to inspiring me to get in touch with my Chinese culture and how sport has been my kind of driving force.
Yeah, well, I mean, he was a real revolutionary with was it the 100 Days Reform War around that led to, I guess the modernization of China and Sun Yat-sen and beyond that. Hopefully, you will revolutionize badminton in Australia as part of that. But that may be a big call. Is there, in terms of engaging in China, did you deliver that speech in Mandarin when you gave that 10-15 minute speech about Kang Youwei?
I did about the first third in Mandarin and then the
Wow.
second, the rest of it in English. Yeah.
Well, that's amazing. Well, that's awesome. So I'll come back to you, Gronya, but there's a lot of questions there, but I think I don't know what's more frightening, sort of going to the Olympics or doing. I mean, I do speak Mandarin, but to do a presentation in Mandarin for that length of time,
It was terrifying.
is phenomenal. And you mentioned tiger mums and tiger parents, and I'm not saying that you're a tiger parent, but you are the mother of a Hollywood heartthrob in Chris Pine. Anyone who's seen Crazy Rich Asians will know he's the hot one. So, and congratulations. But in light of that's only just a very small part of the contribution you've made to Australia-China relations, and specifically, I mean, almost 50 years ago, you started training in Kung Fu and Kung Fu, setting up your own women's self-defense, I guess, academy and style. I think you're the only Hall of Fame martial arts instructor in who's a woman, which is amazing. I know because we're friends, we're fellow Melbourne Football Club supporters. I follow you on Facebook, and you shame me with your exhibitions of what you can still do, and your flexibility and your power and your strength. And I think you bring that not only in terms of what you've achieved, but also the trophies behind you in terms of your love of racehorsing, and you know, being one of the co-owners with Barry with Fiorente, the 2013 Melbourne Cup winner. I think the first Chinese Australian owners to win the Melbourne Cup, which is amazing. But I think more importantly, in how I've known you through the AFL Multicultural program, but also just your support and your passion for the community. And we certainly saw that at the start of last year with some of the work that you did in terms of making sure the community gave back, and not only to China, but also to the Chinese community here. So, and we're delighted to finally have you at an ACBC event, because often you're one of those powerful people behind the scenes, the producer, like Sarah said, that informs and directs and guides and influences. And it's your time to be on the stage. So, and what I wanted to ask you was, I think something like Kung Fu or Kung Fu is so intrinsically Chinese. It's sort of, the culture's part of it. Can you talk to me about what we were talking about before, about the cultural power of Kung Fu?
Yeah, sure. Thanks very much for having me, Tom. And thanks for that wonderful introduction. I wasn't sure if you were talking about me. But I think I'm in a very, very privileged position, because having practiced martial arts for over 40 odd years, I've come to realize that Kung Fu has a very, very special place. It's very unique in the sense that people that come in through the door already have a tremendous respect for the Chinese culture. And the seeds for a respectful and fruitful relationship have already been sown onto very fertile soil. There's no need for me to convince them how good Chinese martial arts is, because that's why they're through the door. They want to learn. And through that, they get to learn. If we take them on training camps, you know, they learn about the Chinese food, the Chinese meditation. You know, we talk about yin and yang, the philosophy of Chinese culture in terms of our techniques. So they already come with a huge curiosity, and that their love for Chinese culture is synonymous with Kung Fu already. So there's really not a lot of need for me to convince them. It's a very, very unique position. And we're very privileged to be the spreader and the motivator behind this wonderful Chinese culture. And at the start, I didn't realize, but through the years, I've really come to be a firm believer that Kung Fu is just a fantastic cultural bridge between Australia and China. You know, when you're in a Kung Fu class, there's just the cultural barriers are invisible. There's no talk about this being something else that's not Australian. It's just something that they practice. They do it in, day out, and let me give you an example. For example, you know, when you look at I'll mention someone from the 70s that I'm sure everyone knows, Bruce Lee, right? Now, do we look at him and say, oh, he's a Chinese actor? No, we just say, hey, he's a perfect specimen of a human being. Or we say, you know, he's a beautiful martial arts genius. We don't actually classify him as Chinese anymore. I've had people coming through the door for, you know, many, many years just saying, oh, I just want to be like Bruce Lee. And where else can you find something in Chinese culture that motivates people around the world to want to be that particular sport, to be like Bruce Lee. So I think he sets he really opened the door for Chinese culture. If not, sorry, Tom, you were going to.
No, I was going to say, but so with that, with your students, do you notice that they may come in for self-defense, or they may be attracted from the physical aspect and the form of a martial arts? But does it then also, do they often get like you sort of said, a gateway or a bridge? Is it often a way within which that they then might take up Chinese language, or they travel to China, or
definitely.
Is it a way within which that they connect in through that?
Yes, yeah. Great question, Tom. They do. Like, we've taken students back to China to visit the Shaolin Temple in 2013. Wing Chun Kung Fu was actually officially branded back to the Shaolin Temple, and we had students coming with us traveling through China. We went from Henan to Fujian, and they had a wonderful time learning a lot more about Chinese food, the places, and Chinese culture in general. And people have taken up learning the Chinese language, for example. They've married Chinese wives. We've had many marriages through the classes, multicultural marriages, and it's just tremendous to see how inside a Kung Fu class there is just no national boundaries. You can't imagine a student having prejudices against Chinese culture when they're really wanting to learn the essence and the intrinsic part of Chinese culture.
Yeah, I mean, I think growing up, certainly Bruce Lee was one of those things that I certainly saw, and then Jet Li, and I mean, when I was in China, I actually tried to do Zaiqian, which is drunken boxing, and I was
Were you drunk, Tom? Were you?
No, well, I was a uni student at the time, so I thought it was a good easy way to kind of bring two of my loves. Yeah. But then I realized that it was actually more about imitating it. But one of the styles that you talked about there, and I'm not sure if people are across it, but Wing Chun, if I understand correctly, was actually invented by a female fighter, or a woman.
Yes.
And the belief was that her thigh muscle was always going to be, or the core strength was going to be, that where the power comes from would beat any male opponent. Can you talk us a little bit about the history of Wing Chun, and is that what?
Love to, Tom. I'm glad you brought it up. Yes.
And is that something that is that what your style is based on?
It is. Yeah. Wing Chun is the only style in the whole world that was ever developed by a woman. Yay! Come on, bit of cheers for all the women in the world. Because it was developed by a woman, the techniques don't really require much physical strength. They require relaxation, coordination, and as you mentioned before, the building up of your core strength. So if you've got good core strength and good strong legs, you can transfer that power. And I'm sure there are lots of sports women here on Zoom today that would understand what I mean. If you've got a strong stance, you can do so many things with your upper body because you can transfer that power into your hands. And that core strength will be really good for AFL women as well, because you can tackle and you can do a lot more when you've got that core strength. And I have to mention too that Bruce Lee, we all know Bruce Lee, but I think very few of us actually realize that he practiced Wing Chun, and it was his Wing Chun that took the world by storm when he went to America and took on the likes of Chuck Norris and all those other practitioners because of the speed, the quickness, the directness, the center line, and so on in his Wing Chun, that he was able to do so well and impressed a lot of the other practitioners because it was totally unknown at the time when he went to America.
I think that's wonderful, like as you said, is that some of those elements of relaxation and approaching it from a very different perspective. And, I think that for those of us that are across the sort of yin and yang and the balance in of male and female, light and dark, and that balance is something that's really crucial. And thank you so much for sharing.
I can go on for days about Wing Chun.
Well, I want to bring in Jasmine, and
Sure.
certainly I know that there'll be questions on a range of topics, Anne, for you. So thank you so much. It gives me great pleasure now to bring Jasmine into the conversation, and I guess there's a nice tie-in through the Melbourne Cup and the trophies in the background there from Anne and Barry in their house. And Jasmine, your background is having been, I guess, brought up and in Singapore and working for a range of tourism bodies, including I think the Melbourne Visitor and Convention Bureau in Singapore, and then coming out to Melbourne in 2013, and then more recently in 2017, going across to the VRC, the Victorian Racing Club, where you now seem to have wearing so many different hats. I'm frightened for you and for Sarah, the amount of meetings that you must have to just sit on because of the areas of responsibility. But obviously tourism, international relations, government relations, and community engagement, which is a nice kind of collection of different areas of responsibility. And the question I really wanted to ask you is that we all know that Spring Racing Carnival and the Melbourne Cup as a specific sporting event is so iconic and is it's ingrained. And I think Sarah talked about how sport, love it or hate it, is part of our Australian psyche and our social and cultural calendar. And the fact that in Victoria and a number of other states you get a public holiday for it sort of reinforces the role that it actually has. But how important do you think it is as an access point, for, I guess, the Chinese community or the broader Asian Australian community to engage with Australia?
Thanks, Tom. I just want to say I'm really humbled to be in the presence of Anne and Gronya, very, very distinguished individuals, and thanks for sharing your story. I think I see sports in Australia as a bridge to bring different communities together, mainly because I think myself, I'm a migrant to Australia. I've only moved here 8 years ago. Through my job, I'm very lucky to be able to attend a variety of events that Melbourne is so well known for. And prior to moving here, having attended those events, it really got me to understand the local culture and how the locals live very, very quickly. And when I made that decision to move here, it made that transition so much easier for me because I'm able to assimilate into the local culture so easily, understanding why footy is so important. The first question I got asked the minute I landed in Melbourne is, who's your team? You got to have a team. You just pick a team because you just have to. And that's a conversation you have over lunch in a pub, over morning coffee. And that helps you be able to connect with people much faster and much easier. I think having worked at a club now for 3 years and understanding the depth and the history of racing in Australia, the Melbourne Cup has been run for, well, this year will be 160th year. It's got such a deep history in Australia that every single Australian person would stop whatever they do to watch or listen to the race. That's why it's called the race that stops the nation. I think regardless of where you're from, if you're working in the office, you're at home, and what your cultural background is, you'll just stop and do the same thing as everybody else. So it doesn't matter if you understand what's going on. You're supporting that one horse that you want to win. Doesn't matter which horse. Everyone's cheering for that horse. So it doesn't matter where you're from. And I think that's the beauty of how sport can bring people together. And I think being someone who's actually local usually is quite open and very proud to explain how footy works, how tennis works, how racing works. And Anne has been, a pioneer, and Barry has been a trailblazer in opening that door for Chinese Australians. And I've worked with Anne and Barry, and they're so generous in sharing their knowledge as well as how to get into racing, what happens. It may look like a complex sport, but really when you get onto course, all you need to do is which horse do you want to support. Doesn't matter if you know anything about racing. I work at a club for 3 years. I still don't have 100% knowledge of it. I pick the jockey I like, I pick the color of the jersey, and that's it. Everything else, just have fun on the day. It's really just an event to bring people together. And it's really, as the title of this webinar is, it's more than sport. It's about socializing. It's about coming together to have fun, families and friends on that day itself in November. Oh, I think, Tom, you're on mute.
Sorry, Jasmine, my screen went a bit funny there.
Oh, that's okay.
You got me back? Good.
Yeah.
And Isabel Jung, who's one of, I guess, really growing importance in her work at Bastion Latitude and in terms of providing market research in language, not just in Mandarin, but it's certainly, I know the AFL, we've used her, and I think she's just finished up a report, and unfortunately she can't be with us today. But could you give us, not commercial in confidence, but could you share with us some of the insights and some of the work that you've been doing? And I think it's wonderful that it's data driven in terms of how the VRC is working with the Chinese community, or some of the challenges, and what have you been able to bring into the business to make it more inclusive or more attractive for Chinese visitors, be they from overseas or local Chinese Australians?
Yeah, very happy to share that, Tom. I think prior to even me joining the club has already been active in working with the Chinese community, both in China and in Australia. So we do have a physical office representation in Shanghai, and that office really is to drive awareness of the Melbourne Cup Carnival, I suppose, as a tourism experience. While we might be a major sporting event, from someone who's coming overseas who might not be very familiar with our sporting landscape, they'll be looking for a unique experience that they can do in Melbourne. So our job in China is very much to introduce them to Melbourne Cup Carnival. So we do have our own WeChat and Weibo web platform where we actually communicate with them, but also understanding that racing is not a grassroots sport. It's not something that's accessible for someone to go and participate in easily, unlike football and tennis or badminton for that matter. But it's something that someone can come and enjoy and watch quite easily. And that's what the message we want to communicate to them. But also there's more than racing happening. As I mentioned, fashion has been a very, very popular first pillar in drawing that Chinese audience. Is something that's very easy for them to understand. Visually, it's very beautiful, attracts a lot of women, obviously. So we've done it 2 times now in China, where we actually held fashion competition in China itself for Chinese audience to be part of what it feels like to be a contestant in our fashions in the field. And it was very, very well received. And it also provides a bit of education on what racewear is. I think the term racewear really doesn't mean anything to anyone outside of the racing industry, but it's a nice introduction and segue for them to come and be part of a massive event without feeling intimidated. Often the first feedback we get is, what do I wear? So that competition was actually to help people understand, well, you can actually pick something from your wardrobe and combine it with a headpiece and an accessory, and you're set to come. There's really no strict guideline as to, what you really need to put together, or that you have to go and buy a whole new outfit. It can get expensive, as we know. That's one of the activities we've done in China, but we very soon realized that there's a whole Chinese community or Asian community in Australia that we should be tapping into. There's 1.2 million Chinese Australians living here. All of them are very different, as we know. I come from Singapore, was very different from someone who come from Malaysia or China or Taiwan. Our motivators or barriers are very different. So we quickly realized that we really need to get down to what are the motivators and barriers for each of these communities to come and enjoy a sport like racing. So we worked with Bastion just this year to uncover some of that. A lot of the research that we found, we kind of knew. The data confirmed what we already knew and give us a lot more confidence to be able to implement some of those things. And one of the things we very quickly identified when I first joined was a very obvious thing, but not many people actually would do, is language barrier. Obviously, when you come, you want someone to be able to explain to you what's going on as you're walking around the course in your language. So we actually train up a few event staff who are Chinese speaking to be able to do complimentary tours around the course on Melbourne Cup Day. And we found that that was very, very well received, and people felt a lot more comfortable now being able to move around the course and understanding where to see the horses, where do I get food, where do I see fashion. So those seem like very simple steps to implement, but it made a huge difference for us. And we continue to do that throughout the year by reaching out to international student community and inviting them to come on a normal race day outside of Carnival to help them understand why is racing such a big part of the Australian culture. I think it's part of our desire to want to include them and make them feel welcome in a country where they don't have family. They're here for a couple of years to study. They're trying to build their own network as well. Getting them together and giving them a taste of what an Australian activity is was really important in our objective. Moving forward, using the data we have, we'll be probably shaping some of our experiences to cater to those the local community here on what they're looking for. It could be the premium customers is very different from someone who wants to go general admission within the Asian community. You've got families within that community as well. You know, we talk about the tiger moms and the tiger dads. They do want to have an educational component. How do we actually provide them that? It's not just about, you know, the dad and mom coming. What do we have for the kids? How do we actually tell them about, you know, these are the horses. How do we look after them? What do the vets do when the horses are sick? Things like that. So we're looking at different things we can actually implement to try and attract those communities, but also provide them a sense of inclusion in being part of a bigger event that Australia loves.
I think one of the things that you know, a lot of sports and sports codes talk about is I guess the mirror effect. You know, you can't see what you can't be, I guess. And so, you know, I think with Michelle Payne winning as a jockey, and you know, I think within the racing community that people will be aware that there have been, you know, female jockeys for a while, but that just sort of brought attention, and certainly there have been others, and I'm apologies for not knowing the current jockey who's won all those Group 1 races, who's even better than Michelle, but I think that's really powerful. But do you think there's also, you know, and within AFL, we're grappling with that as well in terms of representation. And I think what Sarah talked about is inclusion's not just gender, it's also about cultural diversity. And that's certainly something that we're talking about here. How are you overcoming, you've talked about some of the training programs or tours and other things. Are there other ways, or how important it is to kind of, I guess, make it as welcoming as possible for those communities?
I think language is a big thing for sure. And I don't say it just for us, but in a recent discussion I had with a tourism group as well, and I made a comment about our tourism ads are all in English. But when you think about driving domestic tourism, a large part of our community, English is not their first language. So they're missing out on that as well, missing out on attracting them. So we need to think about catering to them in that aspect as well, but also understanding what their drivers and motivators are. Like I said, certain activities we don't grow up with. I mean, if I take Gronya as an example, she didn't grow up with badminton, and she was identified and then introduced to that, and that's how she found her culture. Racing is not an typical Asian sport, neither is footy or tennis, but it's just a matter of helping them understand what it is. In fact, it's really important to invite them to come, to enjoy an activity that we all love. Doesn't matter where they're from, doesn't matter what they do. Being welcoming and open and providing information to them I think, is a key to be able to include them in a community. I think all of us, if I think about what's happening around the world, and none of us can really leave the borders of Australia at the moment. You know, we're all here together. We have so much on our doorstep to enjoy. We have so much to share. And I think now is a great time to share those knowledge and those experience and those events with our neighbors and our communities the best way we can.
Thanks, Jasmine. I think that's really true. And I think, you know, Gronya, you must have been a very talented 12-year-old to, you know, one, to be identified, and two, to be able to pick it up so quickly. So I think you might have been a bit modest when you said, "Oh, I just did a bit of swimming and athletics." Were you also did you excel in any sport previously? Were you sort of always out of the house? How did you? Yeah, once you got identified, it's like, I think, like Jasmine said, it's about being welcoming. It's about being invited. How did that happen? Like leading up to that invitation?
Yeah, so I pretty much had like extracurricular activities every day after school. I did my mum's very musical, but I kind of did that 3 Asian instruments. I did piano, violin, and cello, and I did swimming, athletics. I didn't super excel in any of them. I mean, I was only under 12 years old, but I guess athletics is maybe I got 7th in the state in hurdles when I was 8 years old or something, but I never had the passion for anything like I did for badminton. So yeah, when I went to those tryouts, like I always wanted to go to the Olympics in whichever sport caught my attention at the time. But yeah, when I found badminton, it was really it was the skills that I had from tennis, just with the excitement and the things that I found boring in tennis, that badminton had it all. So I was just, yeah, really into it from day one.
Well, it's amazing. And I think if you have that passion, but you obviously have got the skills and the attributes and the determination to do that. Not quite at 12, I think I was 17, and I thought I need, like, what's a sport, a niche sport that I could kind of go for? And I don't know if you've heard of royal tennis, or something now called real tennis.
Yeah, I've heard.
I found someone who could get me in, and I started playing, and I thought, oh wow, because they also have the 4 opens like the tennis. But I got beaten by a 75-year-old at 10 o'clock in the morning who was picking up his wife from brain surgery and had a gin and tonic. And I thought, that's it. I'm never going to go anywhere. So anyway, you've persevered and didn't have to come against any of those obstacles, hopefully. There's some wonderful questions that people have put through, as well as some questions that have come up previously. And again, a lot of support for all the speakers, and I think a lot of people felt connected to your story and through Kung Fu. But there's a couple of good questions. Brett and Colin have asked sort of similar questions, and I might open it up to the panel, and in fact maybe start with you, Gronya. I know that one of your sponsors is Li Ning, who himself was an Olympian, and quite unexpected in was it gymnastics or weightlifting? Gymnastics, yeah. And then famously also sort of did that incredible run in 2008 for the I think lighting of the torch at the Beijing Olympics. But Li Ning is one of the top sports apparel brands. So that's your sponsor. And I think the question was, how can we work with government and other sports to better leverage international markets? So I guess, would you argue that your exposure and your engagement in China led Li Ning to you? Could you explain how that one worked?
Yeah, definitely. So it was after I kind of blew up a little bit in China that I was approached by Li Ning, just kind of starting out with a small scale sponsorship, as I wasn't that high a level at the time. But over the years, we've really fostered the relationship. I've gone to events over in China for Li Ning, speaking to their distributors that come in from around the world. I've done photo shoots for them and that kind of thing. And yeah, through the China market and my Asian kind of following in social media, it's really helped me connect with different brands, especially, Australian brands trying to market to Asia, or Asia ones that want that kind of Australian connection. And even through like governments, we've also been invited to like the Indonesian embassy before to use badminton, because it's also huge in Indonesia as a means to kind of, have a united front through sport and our common love of badminton. So that's some ways that I've found it really beneficial.
And Jasmine talks a lot about the power of language, and so within your I know you've got and feel free to put up your Instagram handle if people want to follow you and your success, and also just all the work that you do on Instagram shames me as well, so that's okay. But language was really important. I think, do you have Chinese, like Weibo or WeChat? Do you do any Chinese language social media?
Yeah, I have them. I'm not as active on them. My Chinese teacher helped me run them for a while, but I'm starting to work with a PR agency called PR Asia, who are in Melbourne, who specialize in that. So I think they're going to help all my Chinese apps get up to scratch.
So Jasmine or Anne, have you got, I think sort of Colin's extension of that question is really like, how do we then use sport as a vehicle for advancing international relations, people-to-people relations, and third track, or what's often called sports diplomacy? I mean, everyone's very aware of the tension that we have in the Australia-China relations at the moment, and the lack of government-to-government, I guess, interaction. What role could sports play? And Jasmine, and I guess Gronya, you're a living example of that. But Jasmine or Anne, have you got anything to add?
I think I really agreed with what Jasmine said before, that first of all, the first thing is to get them there. Like, you taking a AFL game to Shanghai, for example. You're actually taking the sport to China for them to experience. And once they know a little bit about it, they get the excitement, the feeling of excitement, they will become interested, same as racing. You know, Jasmine's trying very hard to get people to go to the races and experience and have that personal experience is so important, and that experience can break down so many barriers. And it's not just, oh, here, come and learn about Australia. It's here, come and have some fun with us. You know, come and learn about fashion, about, you know, what to wear on a race day. So it's about having fun. And that idea of having fun through sport, and then through sport, you're actually learning about a different culture. It is an automatic pathway that you go through. So you don't just go to people and say, oh, here, come and, you know, learn about the Australian culture and be integrated in the Australian society. You simply invite them to an AFL game, and they'll learn about, you know, that sense of brotherhood, the mateship, the support for one another, that really positive competitive environment, and so on and so on, and same as racing. And through that, they'll have a barbecue with you at you know, at AFL, or they'll learn about the etiquettes and fashion at the race course. So it's just such an automatic thing once you get them there. I think the first step is to make it attractive and fun looking enough so that they will get there. And once they get there, they've got their foot in the door, then it's an automatic progression that they'll drop all the prejudices that they have, because they're starting to like it. Just like, you know, everyone loves spaghetti and pizza. So, you know, we think, oh, gee, Italians are all right because, you know, they have great cuisine. Yeah. And the Japanese, oh, they're not too bad. They've got the sushi. So once we start to like one thing, we start to like quite a few other things following through that.
Yeah, and I agree with Anne. I think that invitation, again, is really important. But also the way we've done it is, I suppose, we putting our marketing hat on, our social media platform is really the only way we directly communicate with our audience in China. And we were lucky to be in the position to be able to test what kind of content they actually like. And we find that obviously fashion was a most popular one, but also equine welfare. I think it's something they're quite intrigued how we look after the horses, and the race horses actually have a life outside of the tracks, and how do we actually look after them when they retire. But also recently we've done a little bit of experiment and engaged what they call KOL, an influencer in China, and we made use of Mother's Day, and we used the theme of our rose garden at Flemington, and asked her to create a content piece that has nothing to do with racing, but everything to do with food and roses. So she actually created a dish that's made out of food in the shape of roses for Mother's Day. And that got a lot of traction. It's got nothing to do with racing or Flemington, but we told the story. And then for Father's Day in Asia is in June, and we ran a competition. And again, our engagement was really high for that. So we want it to be relatable to them. I think in any audience, not just a Chinese audience, any audience that you're trying to attract, you want them to be able to relate to you. So the message that you send needs to be something that's easy for them to understand, easy to embrace, and again, invite them to come and have a good time. And I think one of the most important things is be genuine about it. Really be genuine about wanting what you want to share with them, and helping them understand why is this such an important aspect of Australian life, and I would like to share something with you that is important to me.
Yeah, and I think from an AFL perspective, we saw the game in Shanghai really not just as sports diplomacy, but also trade diplomacy. So Austrade had a Festival of Australia that culminated in the game, and within that, what it enabled was, I guess, Australian suppliers and distributors and manufacturers to be able to kind of take their Chinese colleagues, counterparts, customers to the game and show something that's uniquely Australian. And I think for someone who's spent a lot of time in China and has been entertained, you know, at the extreme with, you know, kind of lots of baijiu and banquets, or, you know, Peking opera, it's inherently Chinese, and there's a pride in that cultural activity. And I think certainly in 2019, our last game that we were able to play in Shanghai was also part of the Sir Doug Nicholls round, which is our Indigenous round. You know, and we've got a lot to kind of reconnect with our you know, white and Indigenous or Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander Australia. But I think be able to showcase that, and we had Yokai, a dance troupe that was to perform pre-game, but also at a lot of activities and events through there, and to sort of showcase Indigenous culture, uniquely Australian Indigenous and culture, as well as sporting culture, was such a different approach, and a great way, I think, for businesses and government to connect in off that. So I think that was really, really important. And Brett's asked quite a few questions, but there's a really good one that I don't know if, Brett, you would like to ask in person, but it's talking very much, I think, to Anne and to Gronya around how do we better engage and leverage sports that have greater participation in Asian markets to develop local participation. So I'm just, I guess if I'm trying to understand that, Brett, you're asking that how do we get sort of perhaps non-Asian or non-Chinese Australian or non-Asian Australian participation in those sports? Is that right? I'll just check. Correct. Okay. So Gronya and Anne, I guess, or Anne, if I start with you, you talked about lots of multicultural weddings. So I'm assuming your students come from the diversity that is modern day Melbourne. So whether that's from Indian Australians and British or Southeast Asian. So is it a diverse student body that comes to your?
Yes.
Yeah.
In the 70s, we used to get a lot of Greeks and Italians, and then we started getting a lot more Asians with the influx of international students. We actually started getting a lot of Chinese students as well as Australian students, and a lot of European students in particular. So yeah, there's a great diversity in our school. We see faces of all colours.
Right.
Sorry, I'm just trying to understand that question myself, actually. Is that how to engage, Australian, how do you engage Australians in Asian sports, or how do you engage Asians in Australian sport, or both ways?
I think the first part first. So
Okay.
how to engage Australians into sports that are more popular in Asian Australian communities?
I think understanding that sport is really important, given a bit of a high profile. Well, I'm in Kung Fu myself. I think Bruce Lee did the job for us. And since Bruce Lee, we didn't have to say or do a great deal. And people naturally walk through the door. If you could create a high profile, if you can think of someone that's really interesting, you can creatively imagine that sort of a persona of someone or something. If you can create that story for the public for them to engage in, that will be like Bruce Lee did for Kung Fu. That would be a creative way of doing it to give people the desire to know about that sport. That's one of the ways that I can think of.
I guess table tennis is another, or ping pong's another, I guess, sport. I mean, I've lived a fairly varied life. I was a Chinese language teacher when I was finishing off my postgrad, and I taught at Canberra Grammar School. And I thought I would teach football in the winter, but they play rugby union because they're part of the Sydney, I don't know, APS or whatever. And so the only winter sport I could kind of teach was table tennis. And I loved it. And then from that, I know that Miao Miao, who is Chinese Australian, she's a Commonwealth gold medalist, won lots of things, but again, probably doesn't get a lot of cut through in sort of non-Commonwealth games times. But one of the things that I remember when I was working in an agency, we brought her into as part of Chinese New Year into Melbourne Central, and we called it Ping Pong Diplomacy. And it was really about getting we were trying to get these celebrities to try and beat Miao Miao. And it was sponsored by Swiss. We just couldn't get the insurance, or we couldn't get the radio personalities that we wanted to do it. but instead we just provided the space within which people could play it. So I guess it's more about that opportunity.
That's a great idea, to create stories, to create interesting stories, so that social media can latch onto it. They love interesting story. For example, we could put out a challenge to the celebrities to say, oh, who can punch faster than a female, for example, and we can have a punching competition, something that's people can talk about, controversial, and then they will all come in and, oh, okay, well, we want to see a female beating a guy, or we want to see a female, being able to have the fastest punch in the world, and so on. Just an interesting story, I think, like that captures the imagination of the public can be really good. Like Michelle Payne, that captured the imagination of the world by winning the Melbourne Cup. I think we need stories like that to create, to break through.
And I might finish with Gronya. As someone who's about to embark on their Olympic journey within badminton, is there I mean, obviously you have men and female divisions, and I think you probably even have mixed, but is it a sport that has good representation from a gender perspective? Is it something that you feel you've had additional obstacles as a female athlete, or not so much?
I think personally, I haven't experienced more obstacles than any man, I guess, but definitely within Australia and even the world, the women's participation in badminton is lower. I think it's just that stereotype of, female athletes isn't like a credible career, and, that they have to do the things of a woman of the house and, go to uni, whatever. But I guess also in terms of what you were mentioning with Australians participating in badminton, I think it starts at a grassroots level as well. And within schools, I think schools are starting to get a lot more involved with it. And I'm hearing a lot more people have experienced it from school as opposed to never having seen it before at all. And I think it takes kind of generations, because the Asian community is so obsessed with badminton because, their parents played it. So they played it growing up. Whereas in Australia, you're competing against all these other sports and the traditions that those parents played tennis or they did swimming. So their kids follow that path. So it's really kind of getting the next generation to be involved with badminton so that, when they have children, they get their kids into badminton. So it's a long process. And I think, having grassroots programs that can develop kids and pathways for them to follow and foster their development is really crucial.
100%. Well, I know that Virginia is going to close out today, and I just wanted to, before she does, to thank everyone, particularly for everyone's comments and enthusiasm on the chat line. And certainly, Gronya, thank you for your involvement and good luck. I can't wait to see what happens, and we'll be following. Absolutely. I'm probably going to have to start doing kung fu with you and Barry now.
Today, come today.
That's all right. Well, I've got I'm ready to go. And Jasmine, it's been wonderful as always, hearing your insights, and also just I think how you approach it from a perspective of of data, but also just in terms of what you're able to bring in, and I'm really glad that you and I have started that, I guess, cross sports collaboration. So hopefully that's something that will be growing as well. And to ACBC members and those that aren't, I hope you've enjoyed today's discussion, which is again a little bit different, but does cross over and certainly highlights the role that sport can play, both from a diplomatic, but also from a cultural and even from a commercial perspective. So I might throw back over to Virginia to close us out, but thank you one and all.
Thanks, Tom. And I think that overriding message of that excellence is really contagious. I think, Gronya, you becoming an Olympic champion will certainly spur us on to the badminton scene, and hopefully you'll be a leader and really inspire everyone to get engaged. So, and Anne too, look, you're obviously a shining example, and all the work that Jasmine has done as well is just terrific. In her absence, I'll thank Sarah, who was a very inspirational speaker. And Tom, as always, you're a terrific moderator and a great supporter of ACBC, both in your role as Vice President and also your role at the AFL. So it's terrifically appreciated. If today has sparked any interest from you, our guests, and you'd like to get in touch with any or all of our speakers, just reply to the email that we will be sending you after this event, which has the recording of today's session and the key takeaways. And we'll be very happy to connect you, because I think this is a story we want to keep continuing. I don't like things stopping with an event. I do like trying to find avenues for further engagement, and I'll be certainly talking with Rebecca and Tom on other areas where we can get engaged. Obviously, sharing knowledge, expanding networks, and building cultural bridges is a really important role that ACBC plays, and we are all passionate about it. So we share your passion. Thank you to Jason Fitz, who I think is online, even though he's on holidays, and Global Victoria for partnering with us for today's event. We're looking forward to running a very full calendar of events that are going through really for the rest of this year and into next year with Global Victoria on their Global Alliance program, which is involved in exporting, and I'll be launching information on that soon. So it's a very exciting, comprehensive program. And lastly, we have an agribusiness summit coming up, and if you would like to attend that, please let us know. We've got the registration link will come out to you with the post-event information. So thank you everyone for Zooming in today and joining us. Thank you to our very talented speakers for this really interesting conversation. We hope it inspires positive action and has left everyone with some ideas and a bit of inspiration. So thank you one and all. Have a lovely afternoon and do stay safe.